أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون. لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون. إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون. وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون. وسواء عليهم أأنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون. إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم. إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين. واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون. قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون. قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين. قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم. قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون. وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون. وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون. أتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون. إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين. إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون. قيل ادخل الجنة. قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين. وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين. إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون. يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون. ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون. وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون. وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وأعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون صدق الله العلي العظيم وصدق رسوله الكريم أفلح من صلى على محمد وآل محمد.
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بفضل الله بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله والحمد حقه كما يستحقه حمدا كثيرا الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله اللهم لعن أول ظالم ظلم حق محمد وآل محمد وآخر تابع له على ذلك اللهم لعن العصابة التي جاهدت الحسين وشايعت وبايعت وتابعت على قتله اللهم لعنهم جميعا ثم الصلاة والسلام على خير خلق الله أجمعين محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. قال الله العظيم في كتابه الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وجعلنا من الماء كل شيء حي أفلا يؤمنون. But Allah says we have made every living thing from water. Do they not believe? Okay, tonight's discussion is or revolves around the creation, not only the creation of mankind, but the creation as a whole. It's been a debate for many years, from the very beginning, that anyone that would even question anything about creation would be fought against quite vigorously by the Catholic Church in the history. Even people that would come with any opinion and they'd deliver what they had, they would meet what? They would meet a barrage of soldiers that would come past, take them, define them as heretics. In other words, they're away from religion, they've been cut away from religion, they've deviated from religion, persecute them. And the biggest problem has always been that people that try to extrapolate or extract the law or understanding from the books have been people that aren't qualified to do so. So the first thing that is always argued about, because a lot of the times when you listen to Darwinian evolutionists, they will talk about what the procedure was or what the process was for creation to come to where it is. But they don't talk about how it all began because they don't understand it. All they say is through what? Through the sun and chance life came about. This is how they begin it with. But, you know, and I mentioned there was a discussion where I mentioned Stanley Miller's experiment. If you want to look it up, back in Shahr Ramadan, we talked about the origin of life. And I mentioned Stanley Miller's experiment where he wanted to see if he could create life using hydrogen, methane, nitrogen and water vapor and placing them in the environment and put a current through to simulate lightning. And from it, he saw that it produced amino acids. But the problem is, let's say that took place. All right. But what brought about the hydrogen, the methane, the nitrogen, the water vapor? What brought all these things about? So let's start with this question. What is the first thing that God created? This is a question. Now people ask, What came first? The chicken or the egg? How did it all begin? What was the first thing that God created? A Damascene scholar, yani Alim Shami, comes up to the fifth holy Imam. Baba, just move him. Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Just leave what's talking about. A Damascene scholar came to see the fifth holy Imam, and he told the Imam, the fifth holy Imam is Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, and he said, I have a question that's perplexing me, a question that has baffled me, it's causing me confusion. And he said, and this question I asked three categories or three types of people, and they all gave me a different answer. See, firstly, when you go to the wrong people to ask a question, and 2 weeks ago we spoke about, or 3 weeks ago we spoke about who you go to ask a question, to understand. But if you go to the wrong people, they're not going to, alaykum salam, they're not going to give you the correct answer. Or they may answer your question with the answer that's not appropriate to what you are asking. So he said these three categories of people, whether these people were one person that was an Islamic scholar, or an Islamic academic, or an Islamic philosopher, whether the three categories of people were a Muslim, or a Christian, or a Jew, that's not the question that we have here. Whoever they were, they gave three differing answers. So we asked them, what was the first thing God created? And they would give him three different answers. And this usually happens when I don't go to the source. Have you ever picked up the Quran and you read the tafsir? You'll read, this person gives you that opinion, that person gives you that opinion. They'll give you multiple opinions. Like a good example is when you read Surah An-Naba. You'll say, عَمَّا يَتَسَاءَلُونَ عَنِ النَّبَأِ الْعَظِيمِ. A verse like that there is a lot of conflict over what? Over a great event. And you look at a lot of mufassirin, they say this Naba al-Azim is what? They say the Day of Judgment. A lot of them bring this up. And in one narration where someone comes up to Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam and says, what is this great event that the people are in conflict over? And the man said to him, Hal huwa al-Quran? Is it the Quran? And the Imam said, do you see conflict between the Muslims about the Quran? You know, we're not like the Catholics and the Protestants. We don't have the Good News Bible, and we don't have the King James Version Bible and multiple. We all read the same Quran. Have you ever seen anyone reading a conflicting Quran? They all read the same Quran, whether it's a hardline takfiri Shia or a hardline takfiri Sunni. They're all reading the what? The same Quran. So then they would bring up many things. They would say, is it the angels? Is it? Ask all these. And the Imam will tell them there's no conflict over these. What is the conflict between the Muslims? It's Walayat Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. So the Imam gives him the answer, the appropriate answer for the question. So you're going to get multiple answers when you don't ask. So when he asks about this, the Imam asks him, what were the answers that they gave you? Now the answers they give are not incorrect per se, but they do not respond to the question. This man was questioning about the origin of life. How did life begin? So the question that is a response must be, the answer, must be pertaining to the question. It must be applicable to the actual question. So one of them said to him, it's al-qadar. The first thing God created was the heavenly decree. Okay? Which is what? Which is pretty much saying that Allah Azzawajal, we say qadar is generally the expression that Allah's power of predetermining things. Okay? I don't want to go too much till I get to the second point. The second person he asked told him it's al-qalam. the pen. And this is generally the opinion of Ahlul Amma. The Sunnah have this as an opinion. They have the opinion that it's al-qalam, meaning the pen. Why? Because they mention what's called what? They mention al-qalam is what wrote in al-lawh al-mahfuz. You probably have heard al-lawh al-mahfuz, which is the preserved book. This is where everything is written down. Now, when people think about this, they go, all right, there's predestination. There's fate, there's destiny, what is meant to happen. But this isn't what wasn't the first creation, but I have to explain this point because people are going to say, all right, what is this? We have, before you get to Lawh al-Mahfuz, there are other things that are predetermined for us within our knowledge. Al-Lawh al-Mahfuz is what Allah knows that we do not know. And if I wanted to give you an example, sometimes you will set someone up as a trial. Sometimes to test someone, you might have someone, your child wants to, for example, get a job, and they're not capable of finding employment. So you go up to your mate, because they're looking for a certain pay rate. So you find one of your friends and say, listen, can you work my son for you? And he says, look, I can't afford to pay him. That's all right. I'll give you the money and you pay them, just so he has a job. So then your son's going to work every day thinking, all right, yep, I'm bringing the share in. And I'm doing the hard yards, I'm working, and he gets paid, and he says, I saved all this money. After a while, he realizes the whole time it was you that was paying. So his knowledge to him is that he was working, earning money, but when you remove that veil, he realizes the whole time you had set up the situation. So there's your knowledge and there's his knowledge of the situation. You've seen this where someone has a certain knowledge of something, but then others have a real, this is what God has a knowledge that no one knows, the knowledge that we know. And this opens doors to what? It opens doors for Amrul Bada. Opens doors for Allah to erase something and reinstall something for us. Not that Allah changes his mind. Allah's laws are set, but it's for you, from my perspective. For example, if I lost my job, I think that's it, I'm going to die. I've got no income, what do I do? If my family left me, what am I going to do? There's all these things that I can think of, but I don't know what Allah has in his knowledge. And so that's the difference between what is in God's knowledge and what is in my knowledge. That's why I always have a habit of telling people, you want to do something, you feel, sometimes you're going to leave the house, you don't feel comfortable, pay sadaqah before you leave. Give money to the poor. Pay sadaqah doesn't only mean giving money poor, give money to anyone. Even sadaqahs, do a good deed. Before you leave, do a good deed. Say a nice word to somebody in the house. That's a good deed. Anything, do something good before you actually leave the house. Do a good action before you leave the house. Even giving your child money is a sadaqah. Do a good deed before you actually leave the house, because if something is waiting, it can change. One of the stories that we bring up about this is the story of Nabiullah Isa ala nabiyina wa alih wa alayhi afdal as-salatu was-salam, where he mentions to his companions that wish to see, they say, we want to see death take place. And he tells them to go to a certain place. They go to a house where a wedding has just taken place. And when they arrive, the weddings are not like the weddings are today. Back then, it's in your house. You move in, they have a dinner or something, and that's it, they're married. And when they arrive at the house, they knock on the door, and they ask, has someone died here? And they say no. So they call the Prophet, and then the Prophet says, what did you do last night? They said, after the wedding was finished, we were going in to sleep, a beggar came and knocked on the door, and we gave him of the money that were given as gifts. We gave this beggar. And then the Prophet says, go to where you slept and lift the mattress. They lift the mattress, beneath it there is a dead snake. He said, that was your fate for today. That snake was going to bite someone, and that person was going to die. But because you fed someone, this is where we have the Amr al-Bada', where Allah Azzawajal, within our knowledge, this is what was going to happen, but Allah uncovers and says, no, because there's a knowledge of what was to happen, there's a knowledge of what is to happen, and there is a knowledge of every possible thing that could possibly happen. If we look at the realm of possibility, the infinite amount of things that can happen, they're all within God's knowledge. This is what it means. This is where Allah has knowledge over all things. So that was the second thing. As for the third person, he told him the first of God's creation was ar-ruh, the spirit. So it began there. So then the Imam, salawatullahi wa salamu alayh, says to him that what you were told with regard to all these, before I actually get there, I need to understand, as I mentioned before, that when it comes to creation, that's the point I wanted to say, and I lost it. When it comes to creation, everything was made, as God created, He created everything from nothing before it. So in other words, things began min al-adam ila al-wujud. They didn't exist and they started existing. But from there, Allah used the materials of what He created. Do you understand what I mean? So when He created, He didn't bring any new materials. What He had created, He would create from it. And that's why sometimes you might see arguments of how things are linked. One of the evolution biologists' arguments I bring forward is the fact that we are so closely connected with our DNA to what? To things around us. Why? They say that means this commonality between creation suggests that we're all related. We're all common in creation, but what it actually does suggest, and it should suggest, is that there is a common creator. That's His thumbprint. Because then they tell you what? They tell you, 99% of our DNA is what? Similar to what? The chimpanzee. But who else has 99% of our DNA? Have a guess. Lettuce. Yeah, look it up. Lettuce has 99% of our DNA. So lettuce is also our cousin. So in this. So when they mention, it's something you look up and you'll freak out. You look it up, it's there. That's it. So our relationships and their understanding is all showing you it's God's thumbprint. Allah Azzawajal, not physical thumbprint, Taman, is the creator. So the Imam, when he begins, he doesn't negate what has been said. See, if the Imam had negated what he had said, you'd say they're all batil. Okay. But he doesn't negate the responses, but instead he gives him what response he requires. Firstly, he says to him that Allah Azzawajal was there when there was no other but He. That's the first thing you got to remember. There is a point where there was no creation. There was only a creator. It's very hard for people to fathom because we have this regressive understanding, this regression that we have in our head that this came from that, the chicken and egg argument, and that, and then that, and then that, and it's an infinite regression. It doesn't stop. But there was a point where there was no creation. Then he says, Allah the Almighty, and he said, no one was before His might. And he mentions the verse, Subhana Rabbika, Rabbal Izzati Amma Yasifun. Exalted is your Lord, the Lord of might. He's above what they described. So begin with, the Imam lets you know it's beyond us to even, inshallah, either next week or the week, my next discussion will be about the Creator. Just to let you know, it's beyond our understanding with regard to this. And the Creator was definitely before the creation. Then, as I mentioned, one thing was created and so on and so forth from that first thing. But when it was with Allah, there was nothing else besides Him. Then he says the first thing that God created, he says, was al-ma. The first thing God created, he said, was water. You look at everything. Every living thing is made up of what? The main thing within these living things is what? Water. You look at our composition as human beings. What's the word they use? When something's so frequent, what do they say? Huh? I've just lost the word. The thing that's most present within the body is what? Water. It's all about water. Water, he says, is how God began things. And he begins to explain the creation from water. He says he attributes everything to water. And he did not assign water to anything else. Everything's attributed to water, but water's not assigned to anything else. So you don't say, you might say, for example, this is rose water, but there's no water rose, if you understand what I mean. The water is always the origin or part of something. Nothing, that this is where it came from. Water did not come from anything else. Even when you extract water from something, it originally entered into this thing. So he said that Allah Azzawajal created water, and then he created the wind out of the water. This is how he began with his creation. And then he says, then Allah set the wind upon the water. When he set the wind upon the water, he says that the wind split the structure of the water. If you look at the steps as he brings him the answer of the creation, until the water erupted and frothed or foamed up, he said, and then from that he formed the clean earth. And when he mentions the earth, he says there was no rift in this earth, there was no holes in this earth, there was no ascension in this earth, there was no regression in this earth. This is how it became. This is the first thing created. Then he says there was no trees in this earth. Then he said from water he created fire. This is the process that Allah created. Then he put the fire upon the water until, once again, it split the structure of the water. And from this came smoke. And from the smoke, he created what? He created the heavens. He said he created a clear, clear sky that had no cracks. It had no holes, nothing rifts in it. And then he says, أَمَّا السَّمَاءُ بَنَاهَا رَفَعَ سَمْكَهَا فَسَوَّاهَا وَأَغْطَشَ لَيْلَهَا وَأَخْرَجَ ضُحَاهَا. Allah raised the ceiling, of the heavens. He says that the heavens, he made it, he raised the ceiling and proportioned it. He darkened its night and extracted its brightness. So this is the process of the creation. There was no sun, the Imam says. There was no moon. There was no stars. There was no clouds. This is how it all began. Then he folded it up and he placed the heavens above the earth. And he arranged the two creations. So he's raised the heavens above the earth, and then he says, وَالْأَرْضَ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ دَحَاهَا. Then he spread the earth. So then the Damascene said to him, the Damascene scholar, said, what about the verse that says, أَوَلَمْ? This is where we go back to how people translate things themselves. He says, أَوَلَمْ يَرَى الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَنَّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ كَانَتَا رَتْقًا فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا. A lot of people use this verse to say that what? That the samawat and the ard were together. And then Allah cleft them apart. And then he says that this is what they say. So that they were together, then God split them apart. And then the Imam says, Astaghfir Rabbak. Ask your Lord for forgiveness. Because then he explains what the verse means. Kanata ratqan does not mean that they were stuck together. Listen to this. He says it means they were closed, that they had nothing to offer. The earth was, like I said, a flat earth doing nothing, and the heavens had nothing. Then he opened the heavens to release the rain. Then from the earth came the seed. This is what he means by فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا. That from them, he opened them up to be able to give. This is how it started with all the creation. Then, this is an important point for us, not once again to interpret in our opinion. After this, the Imam mentions on how then creation came after this. Allah put every living creature. So, because Allah had put the living creatures on the earth, before this, how were they able to subsist. At no point does it mention the age of the earth in this narration, or what the universe is and how did it grow and how did it expand. Because in religion, you're not allowed to give your own opinion. It's not like you can't sit there and give an opinion on what is the possibility. It either is or it isn't. So this was enough to satisfy this scholar. Now, had the man asked him what's the first creation, the Imam knew what to answer there. Hello, we have hadith that says the first creation was other than that, but doesn't say that it wasn't water. So what the answer that this man wanted was, how did life come about? And the Imam answered him back based on this. He didn't say it was the aql like some other narrations say. He didn't say it was the aql, meaning the intellect, or the ruh. And he didn't say what other narrations say other than that. In fact, the question will arise from people, all right, what about the Christian opinion that's also mentioned in the Quran, that God created life in 6 days? You know, you open up the book of Genesis in the Bible, it speaks about 6 days. In the Quran, Allah Azzawajal says they created the heavens and the earth in what? In 6 days. Now, one of the biggest problems here we've got to think about is what? There was no sun to begin with, because this is what we used to. Remember I said there's no sun or moon. So how do we count time? The orbit of the earth on its axis, and the orbit, that counts what? That counts the days. The years are by what? The orbit of the earth around the sun. So they didn't exist. So in terms of time, it's not talking about your 24-hour time. It isn't. And there's proof of this, because we have narrations or verse in the Quran that says, in a verse in the Quran about Day of Judgment, it says that the Day of Judgment is 50,000 years. Once again, this does not mean our years. We do not understand what the 50,000 years means to begin with. We have a day with your Lord's like 1,000 years. Sometimes the meaning is also within another meaning for us not to understand. People ask further questions. Why? Because the answer may not be there, and this is for us to answer. The answer is present, but we may not be able to fathom the answer. If I was to tell you about the past, you know, back in, and you hear these stories a lot, you go back 100 years, the first person that would turn up with what? I remember there was a story once of a scholar, an academic, that when they told him about the camera when it first was made, he didn't believe it even existed. He said, this is a lie. This is not possible. What you're saying, someone presses a button and the image of what he sees this is impossible. This is heresy. This is lunacy. And I went mad. So if you were to go back with your iPhone 13 Plus and start taking photos, because you're not going to use an Android, that's for sure. So you go back with your iPhone and you're taking photos back there, okay? And they're watching you. Do you think people are going to walk by it on their merry way and no one's going to turn around and say, what are you doing? They'll lynch you. They'll say this person's a witch. Take him, let's burn him. Put him on the stake. This is the way the perception was. So any point that was brought in, people weren't ready. If I was to sit there and go back in past, if you were to explain to someone, let's go back before, you go back when Henry Ford turned up. You know, and he made the Ford, the T model. And what was the T model motor? It was a piston motor, isn't that right? Imagine that Henry Wankel turned up with his, was it Henry? Was his first name? The guy that made the guy that made the rotary motor. He turned up and said, this is a rotor. Even to that, they're both things that cause combustion and cause movement. Yet they would still be in conflict over what they see. So let's go back at the time of the Prophet and a time when people were asking questions that were to their understanding. So this is why the responses were in such a manner. You know, one person I was debating with about 15 years ago, he goes, why doesn't God bring down the Quran in PDF format? And I said, Yash Hardy, this person, bring it down for you? How cute is that? Like you want to choose? So what, we go into the future You want it to be on your Kindle? What do you want it to be on? How do you want the Quran to be done? Why doesn't God put colored pictures in the Quran? What? It's not up to you and I on how the message is meant to be spread. One man asked the fifth Imam, Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, about this verse. He says, أَفَعَيِينَ بِالْخَلْقِ الْأَوَّلِ بَلْ هُمْ فِي لَبْسٍ مِّن خَلْقٍ جَدِيدٍ. أَفَعَيِينَ. God says, do they think, you know when someone fails at something, do they think that we were unable or incapable, or we had failed with the initial creation? He says, بَلْ هُمْ فِي لَبْسٍ مِّن خَلْقٍ جَدِيدٍ. The thing is, what they're saying was God incapable of the first creation. It's because they are confused. They're confused with the new creation. See, someone comes up and has a look at what they see today. And they say, listen, this wasn't mentioned in the Quran, it wasn't mentioned in the Bible. But hold on. Firstly, is what you're saying valid or not? That's my first question. Because you know what science is what? Science is something that's observable. It's something that's what? Retestable. It's not something that you bring in your theory. If someone says to you, for example, if someone says to you that, if you look at like hydrogen or helium, one of the reactive gases, hydrogen or oxygen or helium, how are they in the atmosphere? How's hydrogen in the atmosphere? Hydrogen is always what? It's always bonds. It's always bonds. It's always H2. So is oxygen. It's always O2. Why are they too reactive? They have to bond immediately. Then I would tell you, if I was to look at them or look at the reactive metals, I can always test it because you can check in the atmosphere, you'll never find a H atom moving on its own. Okay? With their testing. They can never find the hydrogen atom on its own. Likewise, if I want to look at sodium reactive with water. Isn't that right? Every time I get a piece of sodium, I throw it in I'm not telling anyone to throw it in someone's pool, but if you throw it in someone's pool, you'll see a massive reaction. Why? Because sodium or potassium or magnesium, they're all reactive metals. You threw them in a pool, they have a vigorous reaction. Why? Because that's how they react with water. And that's why I would always be able to test it. So if I wanted to test something, and even in science, you get there's a byproduct. What is it? Let's test this. We test with density. There's several ways that I can always come to a conclusion. So when someone has an opinion that can't be tested, especially evolutionary biology, it can't be tested. In fact, all the people that follow it, do you remember that video where the guy is asking questions to all people in university, and they asked him in the end, he says, how do you believe this for a fact? He says, what? He says, it's written in books. He says, and I trust the people that have told me in these books. He said, so that's called blind faith. This is what you accuse us of having. We don't have blind faith. We can prove to you what you want. It's evident, So anyway, so then the Imam is asked about this specific verse. So the Imam responds to the companion that asked him about this. He says, لَعَلَّكَ تَرَى أَنَّ اللَّهَ Azzawajal إِنَّمَا خَلَقَ هَذَا الْعَالَمَ الْوَاحِدِ. He says it's as if, how we think, you ever seen that book when we were kids, we used to read it, Horden, Here's a Who? Where he looks into that this elephant-looking guy, he looks into this and he imagines this is some universe within this plant. Sometimes we can live like this, where you think you're by yourself, but people like Horton see something else. Most people think it's us. It's all about us living here. So the Imam says to him, do you think Allah created only you in this world? He says, وَتَرَى أَنَّ اللَّهَ عَزَّوَجَلَّ لَمْ يَخْلُقْ بَشَرًا غَيْرُكُمْ. Do you think God didn't create others than you? Is that what you think? The Imam says to him. He says, بَلْ وَاللَّهِ لَقَدْ خَلَقَ اللَّهُ تَبَارَكَ وَتَعَالَى أَلْفْ عَالَمٍ وَأَلْفْ آدَمٍ. Allah has created 1,000, 1,000. This does not, don't make the sum, don't say 1 million. He's only 1,000 in that number. Numbers. Whether it's a million or more, he's letting him know beyond your comprehension. But if we say a million worlds and a million Adams, a million other life that began with people that you don't know of. He says, أنت في آخر تلك العوالم. Akhir could mean that you're either the last or you're the latest edition of what you know. Then he says, وَأُولَٰئِكَ الْآدِمِينَ. And of these. So in other words, what is he talking about? He's talking about these nations were on this earth. These worlds of humans or whatever they were, these creation, living creation were on this earth. 1,000 before Adam on this earth. Now, the thing is, the other question comes in when it comes to creation. What is the other reason? And this comes towards the grand scheme of things. Why is the system the way it is? We can go to a long discussion about this world. Allah Azzawajal has brought you into this world and He tried you. And what is your trial? From the very beginning, Allah created the objective of your trial. Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam mentions in a narration, he's speaking to Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. And when he says these narrations, he says, وَلَا فَخْرٍ, when he's speaking this narration. In other words, I'm not here to boast, I'm here to tell you what it is. He says, مَا خَلَقَ اللَّهُ خَلْقًا أَفْضَلَ مِنِّي. Says it straight out, Allah did not create any, not human, any creation that is better than me. He says, وَلَا أَكْرَمَ عَلَيْهِ مِنِّي. And there's nothing more dear to Allah than me. Just to let you know the status of the Prophet. Then Amir al-Mu'mineen, obviously he, Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, we see many times, what does he do? He asks a question that no one else is going to ask. He asks a question just to, just in case someone has any question mark. He says, Ya Rasulullah, فَأَنْتَ أَفْضَلُ أَمْ جِبْرَائِيل. Are you better or is Jibra'il, the angel Gabriel? Who's better? Why? Because we have a lot of hadith that Rasulullah says, عَلَّمَنِي Jibra'il. Jibra'il taught me this. We have a lot of hadith. I remember one guy, he would negate these hadith. I told him, well, how do you negate them? He said, I don't believe anyone can teach the Prophet. I said, don't negate the hadith based on that opinion. The only alim is Allah Azzawajal. He's the only one with knowledge that's essential. Everyone else gains their knowledge from who? From Allah. How Allah does this, He does it in any way. How can if someone teaches you, does that mean something or shows you something? Does that mean that this person is better than you? No. Proof of this is when Khidr, who wasn't a prophet, was teaching Nabi Musa, who was a Rasul and Ulul Azm. Khidr wasn't greater than Musa. Allah Azza wa Jal had given him a specific knowledge to pass on. So Amir al-Mu'mineen wants to show this. Who is better, you or Jibra'il? So Rasulullah says, Ya Ali, inna Allah tabarak wa ta'ala faddala anbiya'ahu al-mursaleen ala malaikatihi al-muqarrabeen. To begin with, Allah's messenger prophets, He said, are better than His, not angels, His near angels. Muqarrabeen, people like Jibra'il, Mikail, Israfil, Azrail, alayhim as-salam, the messengers of God, alayhim afdal as-salatu was-salam, are better than them, the Prophet says. He says, وَفَضَّلَنِي عَلَى جَمِيعِ الْأَنْبِيَاءِ وَالْمُرْسَلِينَ. And I am better, Allah has chosen me above all His prophets and all His messengers. Then He says, وَالْفَضْلُ بَعْدِ لَكَ يَا عَلِي. So after me, you're the next. You're the next in status after me. وَلِلْأَئِمَّةِ مِنْ بَعْدِكَ. And after you are the Imams after you. Then He says, فَإِنَّ الْمَلَائِكَةَ لَخُدَّامُنَا وَخُدَّامُ مُحِبِّينَ. That the angels are our servants and the servants of those that love us. So in other words, when you attach yourself to Allah Azza wa Jal, you attach yourself to religion, then your status is above the angels. And then he says, Ya Ali, and he mentions the verse in the Quran, الَّذِينَ يَحْمِلُونَ الْعَرْشِ وَمَنْ حَوْلَهُ يُسَبِّحُونَ بِحَمْدِ رَبِّهِمْ. And then he says, وَيَسْتَغْفِرُونَ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. Those that hold the throne, not only do they, listen to this, glorify Allah, they do istighfar for who? The believers. They're not only worried about glorifying God, but they're also worried about asking Allah for forgiveness and protection to the believers. They're at your service because you've attached yourself to awliya Allah. And then he says in this, وَيَسْتَغْفِرُونَ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا بِوِلَايَتِنَا يَا عَلِي. So when we look at the water is attached to what? The water is attached to everything that comes from it. But the origin of everything, the reason for everything is them. And then he says, he continues to let you know, he says, لَوْلَا نَحْنُ مَا خَلَقَ اللَّهُ آدَمَ وَلَا حَوَّاءَ. Allah would not have created Adam or Eve. Adam or Eve would not have been created once for us. وَلَا جَنَّةَ وَلَا نَارٍ. No heaven, no hell. وَلَا سَمَاء وَلَا أَرْض. Now you understand, why would God create hell because of them? There's a hadith on it. Why would Allah create heaven because of them? Why would Allah create hell because of them? Allah, in a hadith we know, لو اجتمع الناس على حب علي بن أبي طالب لما خلق الله النار. If there was known that everyone would unite upon the love of Ali, there would be no hell. The hell was made, and this isn't a Shiite narration. So someone comes and says, Shia have made this narration. No, it's a Sunni narration. It says that the mu'min is known through what? His love for Ali. And the munafiq is known through what? This is a Sunni hadith. Go look it up. Through his hatred towards Ali. When you see someone that detests Amir al-Mu'mineen, he doesn't have to say, I hate Ali ibn Abi Talib. When he says, I love Muawiyah, it means he hates Ali. You can't. If someone came up to you right now and says, listen, I love the Muslims, but I love Israel. Would you accept that? He says, I love the Muslims, but I love the CIA. You can't. Or I love the Muslim community, but I also love the heavy-handed police force against the Muslim community. It doesn't work. The people that are against you, they don't work. The reason I'm giving these examples, imagine it's in absolute. So I'm giving you these are partial good and evil. What if I give you absolute good, which is Ali ibn Abi Talib, and absolute evil, which is Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan? Anyone that associates with this negates that. Isn't that right? So anyway, فَكَيْفَ لَا نَكُونَ أَفْضَلَ مِنَ الْمَلَائِكَةِ. How is it then we are not greater than angels? Of all this is intact. Then he continues to say how Allah Azzawajal, when he created Nur Muhammad wa al Muhammad, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, that they were the ones that taught the angels to glorify. And he says it in detail and exalt. Then he mentions that when Allah ordered the angels to prostrate to Adam, these are all hadith that are known, that we were the ones that were placed in the loins of Adam, then Allah ordered them to prostrate to him. Then he mentions when he went up to the Isra and the Mi'raj, the ascension, he said, and I prayed Jama'ah, when Jibreel said the adhan, Jibreel said the iqamah, this is in the fourth heaven, he said the adhan, the iqamah. Then when it came to prayer, the Prophet said to Jibreel, are you leading the prayer? And Jibreel there says, no one comes in front of you. I'm here to be of service to you. He puts him before him. In fact, in a hadith, he says, I never walked. In another hadith for the Isra Mi'raj, he's with the Prophet. He always has the Prophet in front of him. And the Prophet says, why do you always place me in front of you? He said, I never advance in front of the son of Adam after the day Allah commanded me to prostrate to Adam. This is absolute obedience to God. That's your status. Imagine if you are the master of creation. Allah's favored creation in this case. Then when eventually he calls him to go past to the highest level, the station of height, Jibreel said, if I surpass this point, my wings will burn. I can't go further than here. So all of this is in this long narration. So your first part of creation is the creation with regard to water, and every living thing came from water. The second one has regard to what our objective is in life. Our objective is to be servants of God. And the model of servitude to Allah, the model of being subordinate to Allah, are Muhammad wa al-Muhammad salawatullah wa sallam. They are the embodiment of this, and then Allah Azzawajal shows him a list of names. And this is the end of times when it happens with this. He says after he reads the names are the names of the Imma alayhim salam. He says these are the ones that will rule after you. He says their names are from Ali all the way to Al-Mehdi salawatullahi wa salamu alayhim ajma'in. And then he says that from the rise of the one that will restore justice, all my awliya will rule until the day of judgment. So after that, there's going to be no more disorder till the day of judgment. There'll be no more of this, you living and putting up with what you put up on a day-to-day basis. Wake up every morning, leave the house. It's hard enough just trying to be a human being, but you're a Muslim. Everything is against you. Every word that is spoken is against Islam. They don't let you breathe because you're a Muslim. You know, you think about this. You know, sometimes we condemn ourselves. You know, someone sometimes we have someone in our community does something wrong, and we want to drink his blood. Yet, a politician commits the biggest crime and he still remains in parliament. They tell you, oh, he's alleged. Yeah, because he's alleged because he's someone that's not going to face the same music that a Muslim's going to face. Think about this. This point always drives me mad. You remember last lockdown, all the unmasked people, how were they treated? If they were Arab or living in the West, how were they treated? They were getting beat down. They were getting beat down. A guy last week comes out in Wingdang, next to Wollongong, firing a rifle. Firing. Did you see how the cops met him? It was like, hey, Joe, you know, like that. You know, didn't see you last weekend. They were walking with him as if he was a good bloke. The guy was firing his firearm. Nothing happened to him. This is the world you live in. This is no more when the Imam rises. No more. There's equality after that. Your skin color is not a birthright anymore. You're all one under the nation of Islam. You're all one. You're all equal. Allah Azzawajal does not favor anyone. Even if you look at Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, read historically how he used to even treat the mushrikeen. Take a look. Before they even went to war. The way even after war, the conquest of Mecca, didn't they conquer Mecca? Rasulullah went into Mecca. How did he treat them? He put his head in line with the saddle. So he didn't look at their faces because they were vanquished. He didn't want to see their faces of defeat. And he said, what should I do with you? You've been overcome. You're now prisoners of war. What do I do with you? And they said to him, Akhun Kareem, wabnu akhin Kareem. That you are a kind, a noble brother and a noble cousin. Look at the words they used out of their hypocrisy, not because they meant this. And the Prophet said, okay, you're free. Didn't say, all right, round them up, let's punish them all. No, you're free to go. Didn't set up a prison on an island like Camp X-Ray where they had no access to courts. None of this. This is the Islam that will eventually thrive. This is Islam where human rights will actually be existent, unlike what they are today. With the selective human rights, people choose where human rights apply and where they don't today. We ask Allah Azzawajal to hasten the reappearance of our master Al-Hujjat ibn al-Hasan al-Mehdi and grant us the opportunity to serve him, to stand beneath his standard and to be martyred by his side. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم قل لوليك صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. ولأرواح المؤمنين والمؤمنات ولأرواح موتانا وموتاكم ولقبول الأعمال وقضاء الحوائج وتعجيل الفرج وشفاء المرضى ولروح أمواتنا جميعا. Someone asked me to also mention, just in case I forget, to mention also a person that's passed away. Those that have passed away recently, I just got to get this name so they don't get upset. I just remembered right now. Haji Nawal Hussein Azzuddin, and her mum's name's Hurriya, I think, or Hurriya Hussein Azzuddin. We ask Allah Azzawajal for their arwah and all those that have deceased. We ask Allah Azzawajal to have mercy on them, and please recite for them سورة المباركة الفاتحة مسبوقة بالصلاة على محمد وآل محمد.